She specialises in environmental law and governance, agriculture, and genetically modified crops within the EU and beyond. Her current research focuses on these issues in the context of Brexit. She's a member of the Royal Irish Academy's Future Earth Ireland Committee and is a participant on Horizon Europe project P2 Green, which runs until 2026, looking at the potential to reclaim nutrients from human waste for use as fertilizer in food production. Mary, if you'd like to start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing that I do not have my glasses, so I can just about see the screen, but the rest of you are all a big haze. So on the plus side, I can't see any scowls or anybody falling asleep. So please feel free. Okay, thank you very much for this, and thank you for being here. So I am going to go and talk about waste law, bringing it a little bit closer to home, looking at the EU. And I'm also going to be talking about it in the context of a Horizon Europe project, P2 Green, which is about, as was mentioned, the reclaiming of nutrients from human excrement to use in agricultural food production. If anybody is looking forward to the lunch later, enjoy. And Alexandra Zarnik is here in the room as well. She's part of the P2 Green team, a PhD student in Maynooth with me. And then we have various people from across Europe as well. The reason why I put myself and then plus P2 Green team was because I will take the full blame for the contents of this, but hopefully we will write it up later into something with the team. But anyway, what I want to talk to you today about is this idea of looking at the Waste Framework Directive and Article 6 within it, on end of waste. So the possibility for something to cease to be waste under EU law and therefore to be able to be deemed as a more valuable product once more. And as I was listening to Noreen's talk, I was thinking there's obviously very clear linkages between them, but I was also remembering how this conference always fills me both with inspiration and depression every single time, because you're there going, oh, we could do all of these things. Do any of these things work? So I don't know whether this will be either depressing or inspiring, but we will see. If I can, sorry. Oh, it's the mouse instead, grand. Okay, so tiny bit of context for this, the basis for it. I've mentioned P2 Green, reclaiming nutrients from human waste. Myself, Alexandra, and various people from, well, Joe McMahon in UCD, and then some people from Susquehanna in Greece are the legal team, and we are responsible for 2 deliverables. You don't need to worry about any of this other than that we're looking at the law. And the law in this context covers a whole pile of stuff. The first deliverable was a scoping review, which was about 60,000 words. And I never want to see it again, except we have to do a legislative framework report, which is going to probably end up being longer. Hopefully not if we can manage it. In it, there's various elements that do with fertilizers and water and environmental law more generally, a whole pile of different things, but obviously waste is front and center, which is why I end up looking at waste law, because it's not normally my thing. I do environmental governance more generally, usually, and other elements. Let's get this working. But what I want to talk about within waste then is because human excreta or excrements, human feces and urine, we have debates about the appropriate terminology to use for it. They are obviously classified as waste under EU law at the start. In doing so, it brings it within the EU waste regime, and this is why we've ended up looking at it and possibility for it to stop being waste at some point. So we started looking at the EU waste regime, and for most of you, if not all of you, will know that the EU provides a definition of waste within the Waste Framework Directive. It applies across the entirety of the EU, and then member states try and classify and sort of say, does something count as waste or not? We don't need to worry about the definition too much, but it's linked to the idea of starting with the Article 3.1 of the Waste Framework Directive. That definition is harmonized across the entirety of the EU. Crucial to it, and this is where it starts getting the focus of the talk, is the crucial to the development of it has been the role of the Court of Justice of the EU. And they've taken a very purposive interpretation to this concept throughout the original Waste Framework Directive and also through the current one since 2008. In doing so, this purposive or teleological interpretation has looked to the environmental title within the EU treaties. It's looked to the ideas of the objective of a high level of protection of the environment and human health, and it has looked to the precautionary principle that Noreen's already mentioned as well, that idea that one takes protective measures in the context of scientific uncertainty. And all of these have facilitated the Court of Justice in taking a very expansive interpretation of waste and gathering as much as possible within it to try and regulate, to try and manage waste. And because the more that you can get in, the more that you can require waste management licenses, people have to actually manage and treat it appropriately. The objectives that I mentioned are set from the environmental treaty, but also the preamble of the directive. And now these have changed slightly within the directive, and I'll come back to that in a moment. It is debatable whether it's always desirable because it requires more resources. It's possibly excessive at times, and EU legislators have backtracked on occasion. But generally speaking, it is an attempt to go and enhance the level of environmental protection and human health. And it's very much clear the purpose of approach taken by the Court of Justice. I keep trying to use the keyboard. I keep forgetting it does not work. But the EU, both the EU legislators, when they created a more recent waste framework directive, created some carve-outs. They said, yes, the purpose, but we want to go and we should have this expansive notion, and they didn't backtrack on that entirely. They carved out some exceptions. So anyone who does EU waste law knows the Van de Waal case and the idea that if you dig up earth and you have contaminated soil, then it's going to count as waste. And the legislators had a little hissy fit and said, backtrack, this is too far. If the soil is in your land, you shouldn't be responsible for it being waste and need a waste management license. So there were some backtracks in relation to it, and there were exceptions that were created. But generally speaking, what you had was a confirmation of the Court of Justice's purposive approach. So reflecting this environment and human health approach. They did have some other exceptions where they said if it's covered by other EU waste legislation, to the extent that it's covered, that's grand, but it has to go and comply with the objectives of environment and human health within the Waste Framework Directive. They also created Article 5 and Article 6, which is the one that I'm going to be looking at in a minute. Article 5 is to do with byproducts, so products that are created and some side product that you create during your processing, industrial process. There are various criteria that are involved in that. I'm not going to look at that, but it was essentially confirming approach by the Court of Justice. And then Article 6, which is, again, confirming to a large extent the approach by the Court of Justice, but arguably going and creating extra criteria or amending it as we go along. So a little bit on just these generally before going into Article 6. So Article 6, I suppose the general gist of it would be that it is saying that something that was once waste, once it has gone through a set process and meets various criteria, can cease to be waste. And so you have an end of a process, or you end up having that circular economy, hopefully, because it's coming back into the life cycle again of the goods. Before we get into the detail of it, the important point to note here from the analysis perspective is that, again, across all of these, we see the purpose of the environment and human health. So within Articles 5 and 6, they actually mention the environment and human health. We have these criteria, but it is sort of imbued or embedded within it. They also have now within Article 1 of the Waste Framework Directive, they have amended it to include the idea of a just transition to the circular economy. So Article 1 includes objectives in relation to resource efficiency that was already mentioned, but now also expressly a just transition to the circular economy. Linking these together, there is a sort of expectation that Article 6, the end of waste, would help facilitate this. That Article 6 will be the one that would say, will help you transition to the circular economy by taking something that was a product, that became waste, that has gone through a recovery process, and it comes back to being a product again and continues through. But always linking into that environment and human health. Okay, let's get into actual Article 6. Sorry. Okay. Article 6. I've got bits of it here, but I haven't put up the entire article for obvious reasons because it's huge. Article 6 is the end of waste. It's entitled end of waste. It is the idea that, as mentioned, that something can cease to be waste. Prior to the Court of Justice developing its approach, and prior to this provision, there was the idea that something becomes waste, it stays waste forever. And so if I take this remote and I go drop it on the floor and break it, and I'm like, whatever, throw it in the bin, it's waste. I'm discarding it, it's waste, I need to discard it, whatever. There was never, without having something along. Yeah, that's about right. I'm just living, it's what is a lived experience, a lived experience with real demonstrations. Next one is I don't put me in the bin. I'm going to put that back carefully. Sorry, Pat, if you're watching this. Okay, so you have it where it would become waste and you throw it away, and it would never be able to stop being waste. And not only is that a perception element, that is also something that then requires to be managed. And typically we require what makes waste management licenses, but someone is a holder of waste and they have extra responsibilities. And if I were to go and take the lovely broken remote and make some beautiful piece of art out of it, and I go, it's a beautiful piece of art now, I give it to you. Without something along these lines, it's still waste. And you're now a holder of waste, and you still have to go and deal with it, and you still are falling within the regime, and it would be, depending on the approach within the member state, it would have to be managed. But you probably get an exception. To be honest, people wouldn't probably bother about it, but it's still waste. If I do that with one remote control turned into a beautiful piece of art, I swear I'm artistic, and go and do that, no one's really going to bother as much. But if I were someone who took all of these seats here when they were done with, and I try and make something new out of it, and I'm trying to sell this and try and put value on it, not only will I have the waste managed, but anyone who wants to buy it is going, do I want to take something that was once waste? Do I want to take something that is still waste? Do I need to do this? And so it makes it, there's less of an incentive to take something and recycle or recover it, and there's less of an incentive to actually take or purchase something that has been waste and may still indeed be waste. And so this provision is essential from that perspective. It helps go and provide an incentive for individuals to go and put things through a true recovery process. And it provides an incentive for people to go and take the products at the end of it. And we might like to think that we don't need commercial incentives, but this is also about an economy, and it's involving industry. And it might at that stage be something where it can be like, well, we can substitute in different things. Okay, enough of the ramble and enough of trying to break things. So Article 6, in order to go and implement, it imposes an obligation on member states that they shall take appropriate measures. I actually can't read this screen, it's ridiculous. To ensure that waste which has undergone a recycling of other recovery operation is considered to have ceased to be waste if it complies with the following conditions. Obligation to take appropriate measures. That's great, we're going to have that. I'm going to be coming back to this in a minute. Take appropriate measures following a recovery operation. Recovery operation is defined in the legislation, and there are various examples of it. This provision was not there when in the 2008 Waste Framework Directive. The paragraph was amended to impose a direct obligation on member states because no one was really doing anything with it. But that is an obligation on them. We must take these measures. There are 4 conditions that are there. These have been amended as well since, and they've been made more flexible than they were, but they're still quite tricky in some respects. So essentially, this isn't the language used, but it has to, the product, when it's gone through the recovery option, has to be able to use for specific purposes, and it has to meet, be useful or meet a market demand. That in itself is quite tricky, because how do you prove a market demand early on when it hasn't yet had the sign off on no longer being waste and it hasn't been established? But that criteria is there. And it must meet the technical requirements that are basically in the legislation for it. That's a very simplified version of that one. And it must have no overall adverse environmental or human health impacts. It doesn't have to enhance the environment, but it does have to have no overall adverse impacts. And that can be interpreted in lots of different ways. And it's a little wishy-washy in some ways, but it is an overall one, which is good in general. So there's the obligation. You're like, okay, well, that's it, done and dusted, right? Nope. There are 3 pathways to it, because this is probably a hang up from the original version of the article. but there are three pathways. EU can create further criteria in relation to it. The member states can create criteria, or the member states can do it on a case-by-case basis. Again, this links into what Noreen was saying about you need to have different streams and treat things differently. So the conditions are general conditions, but the idea with the criteria is that you would create specific criteria for specific types of waste. So for instance, in relation to scrap metal, wood, plastics, different types of plastics, hazardous waste, whatever, but you have different types of criteria, for it. The EU, the three pathways for it, it specifies that the EU is going to go and monitor the national approaches, assess whether there's a need for EU level, and then create implementing acts where necessary or appropriate. Member states may establish their own criteria, or they may decide on a case-by-case basis. And there are lots of other elements within the paragraph I'm not going to go into. So there's an overarching obligation on the member states. There are two different ways that they can go and do it if there aren't EU criteria. Again, I keep seeing synergies in relation to your paper, Noreen, because I'm there going, it becomes this bit like, and this is more of the next slide, but it's like, there are so many different ways to do it. Good question of, will anyone do anything? It's like, but someone else can do it instead. But that's why there's an obligation on the member states shall take appropriate measures. Fundamental obligation falls down on the member state. It again follows the general purposes and the objectives within the legislation, of the environment, and it's now beginning to reflect more and more that just transition to a circular economy. It's meant to be reflecting that anyway. Again, there are points to be made in relation to the specific elements of it, and there are also further statements within Article 6, as noted in the last point, about ensuring a high level of protection of the environment and human health and facilitate the prudent and rational utilisation of natural resources. And you're right, Noreen, this one doesn't require that you reduce your consumption, but there's that idea that if you go and try and get something to cease being waste and bring it back in, that you'll stop using the original natural, the virgin resources instead. But it's definitely not a full solution. Okay. I have very few extra slides, don't worry. And this is a general one. And I'm going to talk about Peachy Green. I find it funny when there was a comment about the glass earlier being smashed up, because this is one of the few areas where they have done something in relation to criteria. So bear in mind, this is coming from us having to do this for Peachy Green projects. So we've been looking at this from a perspective of human excrements. I swear I never want to do it because there's all the different language about which from different languages of the different partners, and therefore there's different folks went. But let's play human excreta for today. But we've looked at them more generally to try and see what the patterns are. So EU criteria. The legislation was created in 2008. EU is big pro-environment, human health, big focus on circular economy. They've got two circular economy action plans. In my naive little head, I was like, there'll be loads. Brilliant. There's going to be loads of EU criteria in relation to this. 5 in total. I still don't remember which ones. Glass colours is one of them. Iron, copper, aluminium, some other scrap one, but I can't, as in scrap metal, and that's it basically. They have been developing one in relation to recycled plastics. It wasn't out by March. I don't know if it's out yet. I don't think so. Recycling here. And then there's also the one that they're trying to develop in relation to textiles. So if they did all of those, they would have 7 over 17 years. And the textiles one will not be out anytime soon. The EU's approach is meant to be one of looking and seeing if it's needed. But so you're like, maybe there are loads of national ones. From a Peachy Green perspective, I should say there are none clearly relevant to human excreta. There is a water reuse regulation, which allows for water to be used in agriculture following treatment sort of minimum of the standards of it. That even doesn't lead to something to cease being waste at the end of it. There's also sewage sludge directive, same thing, it's still waste at the end of it. There's lots of bits and pieces, still waste. Other than the fertilizing products regulation, which has an indirect way cease to be waste, but annoyingly for our purposes, we can't use it yet. But there's 5 in total for the criteria. National criteria. So this is where we're going to see it, right? Member states shall take appropriate measures. They're allowed to do it by this way. It'd be nice to have some national criteria, provide certainty. By middle of 2023, there had been a total of 74 national criteria for all products in total across all member states. That's 74 across the 27. So it's just over 3 on average per country. In Ireland, there's 1. And the EPA there is a draft document from the EPA, but it is up on their website still and seems to be the general approach still for it. Which says, this underlines, agency encourage, say that one in a second, sorry. Agency does not currently have plans to lead on establishing any generic end of waste criteria. So they're not intending to go and do so. And instead what they suggest is, hey, organizations and industries, why don't you come together and propose it and suggest things, and then we can look at it and maybe adopt them. And that gives an insight into the reasoning in a second, which we'll come to. So 70 odd across Europe by 2023, middle of it. There haven't been very many more. The countries we've been looking at, there have been none that are relevant for us. They just copy paste in the Article 6 points for the time being and don't actually create criteria. So instead, they look to the second pathway that's open to the member states, which is the case-by-case decisions. And in Ireland, we have, I've now forgotten the number, but it's something like about 13 or 14 of case-by-case decisions that have been made. Some of them are actually in areas that are now covered by the EU criteria instead. Case-by-case decisions apply only to the industry that is applying, so the specific company that's applying for it. So a company comes along and goes, I'm doing X, Y, Z to this waste. It comes out like this. I want to use it for this. Can you tell me it's no longer waste, please? In this case, the EPA evaluates it and says, yes, no. They may not ask for further information. That's the process, generally speaking, across the member states. Some member states say, if you comply with specific legislation, tick box, you're done. We don't care. That's grand. But there's an individual case-by-case decision. That is the primary way that is approached across the member states. And so you're going, okay, well, it gets implemented, right? So we still have these case-by-case decisions. And if I had gone and broken the promotion, created into a beautiful piece of art, and I wanted it to no longer be waste, and I put in the work already and I went, it'd be a bit annoying to have to go and check. But at least I could go and and say, this is everything I've done, please tell me. Now imagine you're an industry, and normally I am going for industry, but imagine you're the industry and you're trying to invest into this, and you're trying to invest into processes that you think are environmentally friendly, and create new substances that are hopefully going to be useful for society. But you want to know if you're going to have a market. You want to know if you're going to be able to go and transport them to another country, even within the EU. There are hurdles that it's waste. You want to be able to know if you can market it. Can you put a label on it? You might not be able to if it's still going to be waste. You might not be allowed to sell it if it's still waste. Everything that they want to do is going to be affected by that waste classification. And they plan for this years in advance because they have to put in the various equipment, they're going and getting the investments, they're going and putting in all the processes. They don't want to know after it's all being done that, no, this is a waste, we need to do something slightly different. Heat it up to 63 degrees rather than 61. My machine doesn't heat to 63. Get a new machine. They need to know it in advance. So even though the case-by-case decision does implement it legally, it's not one that actually furthers the purposes or the objectives of the legislation. And I do realise that Northern Ireland is no longer part of the EU. I am aware of this. I lived in Northern Ireland for far too long. I love Northern Ireland. That sounds terrible, but I do know it's sick. But it's still useful. I would have to look at this for something else. You'll note that the Northern Ireland Environment Agency has on their website a thing in relation to end of waste because they still have the legislation incorporated within their law. And they expressly say that due to current resourcing constraints, that the NIEA End of Waste Submission Service has been suspended since end of February 2025. So basically, it costs too much money, they're not going and doing it. And instead, they refer you to the UK quality protocols, which are essentially general criteria that the UK has, as in UK as a whole has, or that England, and I think they allowed to supplement ones as well. But that reflects some of the issues, and they reflect some of the issues up above as well, where they're saying about trying to get industry and the organizations to do it. And it also reflects the EU, but it's like to an extent, but I think there are other reasons coming in there too, which is the extreme resource intensivity that is required to go and undertake this and implement it effectively, to gather the data, to go and put it through. The other difficulty for us in relation to where it's the case-by-case decision rather than the EU criteria is that suppose you are an industry that gets authorized, that gets certificate of conformity or something like that, say this is no longer waste, and you want to sell it across the border. You're based in France, you want to sell it in Germany. So imagine you're just like right on the border. The other country may not recognize it as not being waste. If it's EU waste criteria, end of waste criteria, that's grand. If it's national end of waste criteria, you need mutual recognition. And don't need to worry about that for the legal perspectives right now, but just to think about that, one area recognizes it as ceasing to be waste, but without having it developed at the EU level, then it ends up basically undermining that as an EU process. So even though it's facilitated by Article 6, without it being harmonized across the board, then it undermines its effectiveness. And I don't want to go too long, so I'm just going to go and probably stop that part there, and then if anyone has any questions, I'll go and answer later. But essentially, it's a bit of a mess now because of this. And one final thing, which was the EU in their joint research JRC, whatever it's called, Joint Research Commission, went and undertook a study ages ago where they went and provided templates, including in our field for ones to do with coming from human excreta, and EU hasn't gone and adopted those. And I think while the resources and expense is definitely an element for it across the board, and especially nationally, when it comes to the EU, there's also the acceptability. So they don't necessarily want to do it because certain member states might push back, and so that therefore poses a problem too. I have one other substantive slide, and that's it, which is the Circular Economy Act. And this is more broadly relevant for the rest of you as well, which is that there's a proposal at the EU level, not an actual legislative draft yet, but there is going to be announced at some stage call for evidence regarding a potential Circular Economy Act in the EU. It was meant to be already out there. It should be coming out in the next couple of months. There's discussion about creating things called secondary raw materials. There's also the potential to amend other provisions within existing EU legislation. For our perspectives, one of the elements would be to amend the EU Waste Directive, Waste Framework Directive. But there's a way to look at all of the EU legislation and think, what way can it be tweaked and amended to enhance the circular economy element of it, and also more generally environment and human health. And so one of the things that we're going to have to go and look at in the next little while is we've already been working with different groups in relation to this, but to see whether there are suggestions that could be made to amend it, such as imposing stricter obligations, timelines for the European Commission maybe, or the point about information is to actually post the information online, but that's challenging. I'm going to be very quick and wrap up with that one. And then conclusion, which is purpose of approach. Okay, I admittedly was putting the purpose of approach partially so I could try and distinguish it from Alex's talk yesterday and emphasizing that, but it is one where you can see the purpose throughout, shaping the legislation, shaping the content of it, looking like it's going to deliver on it, but then the implementation falling through. And the implementation falling through in part has massive implications because this is an area that is significant for industry, and industry needs that legal certainty in order to be able to deliver on it. So that, I think, is it. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Mary. We have some time for some questions. Anybody has anything? Top left hand corner.
going to go too long, even we've too long.
Mine was actually more of a comment than a question. I agree with what you're saying in the presentation. It's just one of the things I'm seeing is the end of waste type criteria now coming through specific waste stream regulations. So you look at the batteries regulation, they have things like conformity assessment for repurposed batteries. And in the new ELV regulations as well, they're talking about, it's already in place, but they're putting it in place more is a process for things like used parts to, move them from waste to non-waste. So it's it's interesting because it's almost like they now have two streams happening in terms of how end of waste is happening.
Really useful and interesting point. And it was one that we were noticing with the fertilizing products regulation, because they do the same thing where they're sort of like, you can use waste as an ingredient. Once has the certificate of conformity, it's no longer deemed to be waste. It doesn't help in our specific scenario, even though it's relevant. As an FPR, it doesn't. But it's funny because they seem to have, I think, nearly accepted that this is either an easier way to do it politically or it's just more efficient way to do it. And yet then they don't go and put it up as this is our end of waste implementation for it. But yeah, thanks very much.
Anyone else? Gentleman there.
Ian Lumley here with Friends of the Irish Environment in Taoiseach. So we would have a lot of contact with the European NGOs, and I was over in Brussels a few weeks ago, and the whole mood was a complete reader. There was already a concern after the European elections that there was a downscaling of the European Green Deal, backpedaling on climate, nature. But the word very much coming from my European NGO friends who've been working on these issues for years, like circular economy, is they're seeing just yes, we're committed, we want to make progress, but in the meantime we're preoccupied with energy and defence and other priorities. So do you have a concern there's serious backsliding and there's going to be really inertia prevailing for years on this? I'm sorry, a bit so depressing. Sorry.
I mean, I've got some positive and some negative. I'll start with the negative, which is, I mean, we've already seen some backsliding definitely already, because we've seen concessions in relation to the implementation in pesticides and so forth. So there's been, the ambitions have been watered down temporarily. There was like, oh, we'll pause this for a while. So regarding things like European Green Deal, yes, there has been some, and likewise sharing concerns. In relation to the Circular Economy Act, I know it's not out yet, and I was sort of, but they'd sort of said spring, and then they sort of said maybe late spring. But I was attended a workshop online a couple of months ago, and it had one of the key members from the EU. I can't remember whether they were meaning to be named or not, so I'm not going to say who they were. But somebody who was heavily involved in this, and they said that there was basically a solid draft for the call for evidence for the circular economy. So they seem to be invested in that, but that might also be because it's also linked into industry. Like industry are very supportive of this as well, because they want it to have a new source of basically money coming in, a new source of income. So yeah, I suppose it's not as positive as I was thinking, but I think they like the idea of the circular economy. I think most people get on board with that. So I think they'll see that being pushed through. But yes, you are right that there has been some watering down at the same time. But I also think, yeah, sorry, I'm toing and froing on this, because there are also things like the Environmental Quality Standards Directive is being revised. And I think they're going to be ambitious with that, like if they're going to have to deal with the microparticles and stuff like that in pharmaceuticals. So I'm not as depressed as you might think I might be in relation to this. Happy to chat with you more at lunchtime about it as well.
We have time for one or two more questions for the coffee break. You're all perking up now when I say coffee.
Yeah, coffee. You can also ask me at a coffee break, and that gives you an excuse to get out and get some coffee.
Okay, I don't see any more hands. So once again, thank you, Mary, and we'll break here.